Welcome to the Global Wired, bringing you the latest news from around the world. The Nile is more than just water. It's the lifeblood of a region, the longest river on Earth, and the force that shaped one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Its annual floods once transformed desert into fertile farmland, allowing Egypt to flourish where otherwise only sand would reign. The rivers flow from south to north, and the convergence of the white and blue Nile in Khartoum created a unique geography that made Egypt possible. For Egyptians, the Nile is not just a river, it's a symbol of identity, security, and survival. Today, as Egypt partially closes sections of the Nile, the world watches, knowing the consequences will ripple far beyond its banks. The Nile's waters are now the focus of high-stakes diplomacy, as multiple nations compete for a resource that once nurtured a single civilization. Any threat to its flow is met with deep anxiety in Cairo, where water security is existential. The decisions made here affect not just Egypt, but the entire region, impacting food, trade, and stability across North and East Africa. As climate change and population growth intensify, the Nile's ancient currents have become a modern arena for negotiation and conflict. The river's story is no longer just about Egypt, but about the competing ambitions of all who depend on its life-giving waters. The Nile's future will be shaped by how these nations choose to share or fight over its flow. Egypt's dependency on the Nile is absolute. Over 97% of its fresh water comes from this single source. The river irrigates millions of acres, sustains over 115 million people, and powers much of the nation's industry. Egypt's population is packed into a narrow green strip along the river, surrounded by desert. The agricultural sector, employing a quarter of the workforce, relies entirely on the Nile. Any reduction in water means hardship for millions. The government's partial closure of the river sends shockwaves through farming communities, forcing a painful reckoning with age-old practices. Beyond economics, the Nile is woven into Egypt's culture, its art, music, and daily life. A diminished Nile is not just a resource crisis, but a cultural one, challenging the very identity of the nation. This deep dependency drives Egypt's foreign policy, making any upstream development a perceived threat. With a rapidly growing population and finite water, the pressure is relentless, fueling tense negotiations with neighbors. Egypt's actions are driven by a powerful fear that its ancient lifeline may no longer be enough to sustain its people. The Nile's fate is a matter of national survival. The Aswan High Dam, built in the 1960s, was Egypt's bid to master the Nile, ending unpredictable floods and securing water for agriculture and power. Lake Nasser, the vast reservoir behind the dam, gave Egypt control, but at a cost. The annual flood's nutrient-rich silt no longer reached farmlands. Farmers became dependent on chemical fertilizers, degrading soil and raising costs. The dam also caused coastal erosion in the Nile Delta and increased the risk of saltwater intrusion as sea levels rise. Fish populations and river ecosystems suffered, and the entire water management system became centralized around a single, vulnerable point. Egypt's security now hinges on Lake Nasser's levels, making the country acutely sensitive to upstream changes. The dam, once a symbol of control, has made Egypt more vulnerable to droughts and upstream developments. The Aswan High Dam's legacy is a lesson in the unintended consequences of reshaping nature. Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam, or GERD, is a source of national pride and a promise of electricity for millions. Built on the Blue Nile, which supplies most of the river's water, the GERD aims to power Ethiopia's growth and lift its people from poverty. But for Egypt, the dam is a direct threat. Any reduction in flow could cripple agriculture and hydropower. The main dispute centers on how quickly Ethiopia fills the dam's massive reservoir. A fast fill could devastate Egypt's water reserves. Colonial-era treaties once gave Egypt and Sudan control, but Ethiopia rejects these as outdated and unfair. Negotiations have stalled, with Egypt demanding binding guarantees and Ethiopia insisting on flexibility for its own development. The GERD has turned a development project into a flashpoint for regional tension, with each nation seeing the river as a zero-sum game. The stakes are high. Every drop stored upstream is a drop lost downstream. Climate change is amplifying the Nile crisis, making an already tense situation even more precarious. Rising temperatures mean more evaporation from reservoirs like Lake Nasser and the Gerd, shrinking the water available for all. Rainfall patterns over the Ethiopian highlands are becoming unpredictable. Droughts and floods are both more likely. This volatility makes managing the river's flow a daunting challenge for dam operators and governments alike. The Nile Delta, home to nearly half of Egypt's population, faces sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, threatening farmland and drinking water. Coastal erosion, worsened by the loss of silt from the Aswan Dam, accelerates the crisis. Climate risks turn the Nile dispute from a simple allocation problem into a dynamic crisis, demanding new forms of cooperation. Old assumptions about predictable river flow no longer hold. All countries face a future of uncertainty. Shared vulnerability could foster cooperation or drive nations to compete even harder for dwindling water. The urgency for a sustainable agreement has never been greater. No single country can manage the Nile alone. Cooperation is the only path to sustainability. The Nile Basin Initiative was created to foster dialogue and joint management, but deep political divisions have stalled progress. Upstream countries want equitable water use. Egypt and Sudan fear losing their historical shares. The failure to agree on the Gerd's operation is the region's biggest diplomatic challenge. Experts urge a shift from rigid water quotas to flexible benefit sharing, like electricity trade and joint investments in water-saving technology. Such cooperation could turn the river from a source of conflict into a driver of shared prosperity. But this requires trust and political will that remain elusive. The future of the Nile depends on whether its nations can move beyond zero-sum thinking. With the Nile under threat, Egypt is racing to secure new water sources and boost efficiency. Massive investments in desalination plants along the coasts are creating drought-proof supplies for cities and industry. Wastewater treatment and reuse projects are turning polluted water into a second Nile for agriculture. The government is pushing farmers to switch to less water-intensive crops and modern irrigation methods. Public campaigns and new tariffs aim to curb waste and reflect the true cost of water. These innovations are vital, but expensive and energy-intensive, and can't fully replace the Nile's volume. The transition is tough for farmers and the economy, requiring strong government support. Ultimately, Egypt's survival still depends on cooperation with its neighbors upstream. The Nile crisis hits hardest at the grassroots. Small farmers are the first to suffer when water runs short. Lower crop yields and rising debt force families to make tough choices, sometimes driving migration to crowded cities. The river's ecosystem is also in crisis. Pollution, reduced flow, and lost silt have degraded water quality in fisheries. The Nile Delta's wetlands, vital for wildlife and coastal protection, are shrinking and becoming more saline. Sudan faces its own challenges, benefiting from regulated flows, but sharing Egypt's fears about dam safety and water shortages. Ethiopia's Gerd brings hope for development, but also risk if regional cooperation fails. Every nation's actions have immediate consequences for its neighbors, making the need for a shared vision urgent. The region's future depends on balancing human needs with ecological survival. The Nile, once the wellspring of civilization, is now a stage for geopolitical tension and environmental stress. Egypt's partial river closure is the result of decades of mounting pressure, population growth, climate change, and upstream ambitions. The clash between Egypt's water security and Ethiopia's development unfolds as the river itself becomes less reliable. The consequences ripple across borders, affecting millions of lives and fragile ecosystems. Domestic innovations help, but can't replace the need for a diplomatic breakthrough. Only a shift to collaborative, benefit-sharing solutions can transform the river from a source of conflict to one of prosperity. The choices made today will shape the Nile's legacy for generations. The question remains, can the nations of the Nile forge a shared destiny, or are they headed for a divided future?